I'm sure most of you have heard of Helen Keller and about how remarkable she was with her skills, even though she was deaf, mute, and blind. When most people think of Helen Keller, they think of how amazing all the obstacles were that she had to overcome to be able to learn how to read, write, and talk. I'd have to say she is a pretty amazing woman myself, being the first deaf and blind woman to go to college and earn a bachelor's degree in arts. However, have any of you heard of Anne Sullivan? Yes, it is correct that Helen Keller was able to learn, write, and speak and move on to do remarkable things with her life, even though she was blind and deaf. But it was her teacher, Anne Sullivan, who helped her overcome all of these obstacles with her miraculous ways of teaching, Helen Keller. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Anne Sullivan, the woman who helped teach and guide Helen Keller through many years. Anne Sullivan is a teacher who believed that even though Helen Keller was deaf and blind, that she was able to teach her the skills needed to make her a successful person, and she never gave up. You're going to hear about Anne Sullivan's early life and how she became who she was with her education, and how she became the teacher of Helen Keller. Anne Sullivan is the woman pictured here. I'll pass it around so everyone can see it. She was born in Massachusetts on April 14th, 1866. Sullivan's family, just like most families, were immigrants. Her family came from Ireland. According to Anne Sullivan's biography on the biography.com website, they explain that Anne and her family grew up in poor conditions, causing problems with her health, which ultimately led to her mother's death and Anne's contraction of an eye disease that caused her to go blind and lose her sight. Ultimately, after the death of her mother, Anne's father abandoned her and her siblings because he couldn't handle taking care of them on his own. Being abandoned by her father meant that they had to go to the Tewkesbury Almshouse. This is a picture of the school, or it's not really a school, it's where she had to live. It was known as an asylum as well. It was dirty, it had poor conditions, and it ultimately wasn't the best place for people to grow up and live in. While Anne was living there, her brother actually passed away because of the conditions that were there, so she was on her own. She didn't have the support that she needed. She didn't know anybody there. And when she was there, she found out that there were schools specifically for the deaf and blind. She decided that she wanted a different life and she wanted to get an education. In doing so, she waited until the asylum was having a tour. People were walking through to check the conditions. And when the people came, she had asked them if she could go to the Perkins School for the Deaf. As I stated earlier, Anne contracted an eye disease. It's called trachoma. It's a bacterial infection, and from itching and rubbing, and if it goes untreated, it can lead to blindness. It's actually one of the diseases that is preventable, but it causes a lot of people to become blind. When Anne had this infection, and with it affecting her eyesight, she needed to go to a school that could provide the accommodations for her to get an appropriate education. In 1880, Anne went to the Perkins School for the Blind. Since we've learned a little bit about Anne's early life, let's look at her success at the school. When Anne went to the Perkins School for the Blind in 1880 because of her eyesight, she was struggling with things while she attended the school for the blind, and she had to have surgery to help her become more successful with her education. With Anne never being to school before, she tended to struggle with her social skills, making it hard to work with her fellow classmates. She was known for having a bit of a temper at her school, and sometimes that would cause her to get into a little bit of trouble. Even with her troubles adapting to her new knowledge of being in a school, she was a remarkable student and made the best of her education. According to the writing of the October 21st, 1936 obituary article in the New York Times, it was pointed out that Anne learned how to study with her fingers, so she would write letters, the alphabet, in her hands, and she learned this successfully until she had 2 more eye operations that were successful and she was able to see somewhat better. Anne soon graduated from Perkins School for the Blind in 1886 and was on her way to her first job after graduating. Now that you know a little bit about Anne Sullivan's education, we will move on to how she started her career working with Helen Keller. After Anne graduated, Helen Keller's family had written to the Perkins School for the Blind in hopes to find someone who would be able to teach their daughter, who was deaf, blind, and mute. According to the American Press Association writing in the March 15, 1915 New York Tribune, Helen Keller was only 7 years old when Anne Sullivan became her teacher. Anne used to spell words into Helen's hands to help teach her, even though Helen had no idea what letters were or what objects were. Anne wanted to teach her the association of a word to an object. So she would spell the word doll into her hand and give her a doll. And then, or she would just write candy, spell candy into her hand and give her candy. So Helen was able to understand that those were associated with it. After Anne had taught Helen words, multiplication, and how to read Braille, she decided that Helen would do good going to the Perkins School for the Blind, where she had previously attended. Once Helen Keller started attending the Perkins School for the Blind, Anne would also attend with her to help her during her classes and would spell the lectures into her hands. This amazing woman I had just told you about has gone through so much in her life and overcame a lot of the odds right before her death. Anne Sullivan was a teacher that believed in teaching Helen Keller, who was deaf and blind, and believed that she could teach her skills needed to be successful, and she never gave up on her. And learning about Anne Sullivan's early life and how she became who she was with her education, along with how she became the teacher of Helen Keller, it's easy to see how remarkable of a person she was. Now when you hear about Helen Keller, I hope you're able to remember Anne Sullivan and her accomplishments as well, as she was the person who taught Helen Keller through many years.